In For a Few Dollars More, we witness a Western which has aged tremendously well for modern audiences, probably because the traits exemplified in Leone's spaghetti westerns have become so abundant in more modern action cinema. The spaghetti westerns, Leone is included, were accused of being cartoonish, like a comic book, not true to life, but animated. Genre films were often accused of being like comic books, as the material wasn't quite as prolific or pronounced in genre literature. It is understandable that genre fiction was more motivating and exciting when authoring comic books compared to anything but paycheck per publication pulp literature. It's all too easy to imagine, for instance, superhero fiction taking off in comic books rather than in literature. It's more exciting to read in a comic book, and certainly far more exciting to write in the context and draw in the context of a comic book compared to writing Superman does this, Batman does that, blah blah blah. You know. For example. So when genre films began mimicking the energy, panel sequencing, and gratuitous gratification of comic books rather than closer adhering to the pretenses of a novel or theatre play, a written medium, textual medium, where it stuck close to the visual mediums of a comic book and or animated cartoons, they really came into their own and became what we know them as today. But it didn't reflect something adolescent and an active attention magnetization in our world's hindsight, quite as much as it even vaguely resembles something modernist, audacious, and, considering the 1960s epoch, possibly an act of accidental or deliberate, who even knows, pop art adjacent shock to the senses in one's face flair. The emphasis on close-ups, the surrendering of visuals to an oppressive soundtrack, the ethereal evil of its antagonists, and the camaraderie of its two dynamic lead players are all characteristics of For a Few Dollars More, which, perhaps via some free associative speculation, are heavily indicative of 1960s cutting-edge cultural phenomena. And if Sergio Leone himself hadn't his particular cultural surroundings in mind when crafting the film so much as his own creativity and imagination, a spark of sizzling originality, well then so be it. Though the appeal of For a Few Dollars More, his spaghetti westerns and those that copied his, very most of them, to a 1960s, developed, Western is, English-speaking audience will become wholly understandable more so. Now, I suppose the Italian westerns could get away with more violence at this time, which may have something to do with these films being appreciated as action fare as opposed to the average, now pompous American western epic at that time. I maybe could claim that the unignorable violence of America's involvement in Indochina, reflecting the desire to depict or witness graphic violence in media more transparently, bluntly, and brutally, although the illustration of violence and its increasing bloodiness and severity is something which was quite possibly inevitable anyway, given the technology, the changing moral landscapes, the consumer's evident desires for that, us being red-blooded carnivorous mammals still, and media being oriented toward adolescents rather than adults, a shift which began in the later 1950s and really took hold by the 1960s. Most violent media today is marketed toward these equivalent contemporary adolescents, whereas cinema, and really popular music as well, perhaps popular media in general at one time, was geared toward people in their 30s and 40s more so, I perceive to be the case at one time, for better or worse. I'm just making a possibly somewhat inaccurate observation here. Anyway, so an emphasis on close-ups. This indicates possibly an admiration of comic books and the emerging dominant comic book art of the 1960s, and how this was reflected in advertising, particularly in the context of print media. Lewis Clark's 66, an animated feature film from 2015, is thoroughly indicative of this aesthetic, a totally unique world to the comic book art of the 1950s. The illustrative landscape of a human face, the dramatic enunciation and the communicative characterization of facial expressions became ever abundant, especially when the era of the celebrity was at its most shameless and romantic, right down to that handsome 35th President of the United States, Camelot. If the 1950s could be characterized by individuals depicted as part of a larger or more encompassing ecosystem, the Fordist economy and advertising, the Western heroic archetype of the classic comic book vigilantes, or the cowboys riding around through John Ford's vast abysses, maybe perhaps the psychologically troubled Hollywood actors playing charming and clean amongst a Technicolor comparative paradise, or consider the popularity of the jazz unit at this time, a tight bebop trio, quartet, quintet. You played on all of the album, piano solos, sax solos, drum solos. You all contribute to the magic of that particular session, but you're playing for Miles Davis, David Brubeck, Charles Mingus, Chet Baker, whomever it may be. That's the name on the record. Then, the 1960s was characterized by individuals attempting to find themselves, and their own purpose, amidst the increasingly chaotic milieu of simple, everyday modern life. John Wayne spoke his motives, Eastwood glared them into you. Even when he speaks, his eyes speak louder. Consider how a 1950s comic book cover illustration depicted Superman or Batman, or both, pondering how to rescue some woman hanging over a pit of hungry monsters, and a 1960s comic book cover featured Ben Grimm looking down at the ground, the Thing, Ben Grimm, evidently in sorrow, under the title, This Man, This Monster. Consider the sanitized Superman of a particularly ridiculous era of that character, it has been noted several times, winking or smiling, giving a thumbs up as Jimmy Olsen gets into some hijinks or whatever. The final panel of your newest issue is some cute ha-ha moment, a quick cheer, versus the detailed drawing of the Vision crying at the close of Avengers issue 58. Even an android can cry. The emphasis on faces dominating the vector of an image can feel like more of a 1960s phenomenon in hindsight, though this being a blog post, essentially, rather than an academic dissertation, I cannot wholly prove this or have the sincere motivation to, and so I will allow others to let me know if I am mischaracterizing recent popular history at all then. So, the dramatic environment of a human face is the focus of an image most associated with Leone than any other Western filmmaker, and considered tasteless in comic art after the pop, wow, buzz, shock to the system era of the 1960s. The close-up as an act of disorienting or reorienting self-realization or self-actualization in relation to a piece of media. Edward Bernay's influence in advertising can be considered here, as well as close-ups being considering trashy and tasteless in Hollywood cinema as anything except seemingly contemplative, glossy show-offs of their gorgeous stars, though being easy, dramatic, lazy stock technique for television, then seeping into the popular imagination and expectations of the cultures at large. Anyway, moving on to the second point. When surrendering its visuals to an impressive soundtrack, here Leone reminds one of the sonic spectacles of the rock show. Even a televised performance, lip-synced I would suppose though, featured a recording which the vocally delivered lyrics are not easily audible over the abrasive, then, wall of distortion. An impactful rock show spectacle, a group screaming lyrics, wrangling an electric guitar and smashing a drum kit in front of you, was as timeless, primal, ancient, shamanic, and yet so thoroughly new, vanguard, modern, revolutionary. In the grip of this fairly consistently up-tempo soundtrack from Leone, slowing down for the more dramatic zenith moments, speeding up for the triumphant chases to the climax, the attention spans of the budding, still babies, boomers, was wholly, maybe accidentally, catered to. A Cream gig was quite imaginably not too dissimilar from the moments in Leone's films at their most soundtrack dense. Now, third point, I suppose. The ethereal evil of its antagonists now, Indio and his gang laugh at the camera, lit like spectral demons, making faces like weathered ogres, not really acting fairly believable for pathologically cold, sinister outlaw criminals. They remind one of how the subject of a psychoactive-induced trip is perceiving of people giving out bad vibes, or how young children can perceive a certain, likely alcohol-induced, overbearing loudness from reckless adults, or how the entities of dreams may behave when in a scary space. That one is the most stretchy of my claims here, so let's explore the uniqueness, the fourth point, uniqueness of For a Few Dollars More in a sea of westerns, both up to that point in time and since that point. The camaraderie of its two protagonists. Why is this the most enjoyable and watchable duo, Eastwood and Van Cleef, in Western history by the standards of the average modern film fan? Why is this the more entertaining as a chemistry-driven Western than anything Hollywood produced prior or even since? So Eastwood and Van Cleef are glorious performers for the Western. They shine here and in many of the Western films that they solely star in. Why did Hollywood Westerns not feature enough of these two glorious charismatic leads side by side, the ultimate buddy adventure? Where were these films? I would suspect that in the 1950s, no actor that much of a draw, but they could star in major Western films, wanted to share the top billing, And in the 1960s, in Europe at that, Eastwood and Van Cleef had no major egos to sate, and so they happily shared the screen, two of the most likeable Western presences of all time, just a bit before they had the opportunity to be widely seen and considered so. Now, the buddy hero dynamic did become very popular in Hollywood by the later 1970s and 1980s, but then the actors had less major sway over the studio productions and were less mythical to the public, and so more examples of two major likable and charismatic lead actors sharing top billing would occur then. It's just that so few of these were westerns, as that genre eventually disappeared from cinemas altogether. Even for the 1984 effort starring Kirk Douglas and James Coburn, Draw by Stephen Hilliard Stern, that was an early HBO teleflick, and well, if you've seen that film, you know how you know what the go is. It's not so bad. It's just, well, you know. So these elements came together to make For a Few Dollars More considered a trash example of gratuitous sloppy entertainment, classless and tasteless at one time, seem very ahead of its time now, and very 60s, in the way that people like to glorify the media of the 60s in hindsight, bemoaning what was exciting there and perhaps not in the now. Even if it weren't for the, in some ways, follow-up being one of the most truly beloved and lauded films of all time, certainly a film which would be on my floating cinema Noah's Ark vessel, I believe that For a Few Dollars More would be considered, maybe it would take more time, but be considered a major, extremely impressive act of cinema creativity, one of the most enjoyable and rewatchable westerns of all time, even if it were not for the presence of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Audiences now, modern film fans, are probably really impressed by this film because they hear of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly being the masterpiece, watch Fistful, like it okay, as most of us do, I think now, but then are blown away by just how good For a Few Dollars More is of itself. It isn't just a trilogy, loose trilogy, made so iconic by one film, the last film of the trilogy, but a trilogy which features three beloved and certainly lovable, at least, even Fistful in its own way, I think, Western films of all time, or even, in the case of the latter two, I'd say, lovable films of all time for any genre. Thank you, my friends. Appreciate it immensely. Thanks again.